This past weekend was a glimpse into Magic's past with a lot of hope for its competitive future. We had one of the largest regional championships that I can remember in recent time, hosted in Washington, D.C., and it was put on by none other than Star City Games, with full coverage from dynamic casting duos and, of course, 2 grueling days of high-level Magic the Gathering Pioneer play. With next year plus of events under SCG's belt, it does a Magic boomer like myself's heart a lot of good to feel a small sense of normalcy budding to regrow after what seems like a giant gap between the start and end of the pandemic and competitive Magic returning to the forefront. But even with history just oozing out of the pores of the RC, the main story remains the same as always. The gameplay, the decks, and the fact that 64 players secured a Pro Tour slot, at least 2 people secured World slots, and 1 walked away with $20,000 to boot. Corey Lack took a Rakdos-laden bracket down with a archetype of his own that was known as Rakdos Tree, or as they saw on broadcast, Rakdos Cauldron. It did take down Connor McKenzie's other flavor of black and red Rakdos deck in the Transmogrify version, and the top 8 bracket had only 1 overlapping archetype present, with Izzet Phoenix popping up twice. But there's a lot more to break down about the room in DC other than just what the top 8 decks can tell us. Now, before we get into the breakdown and analysis portion of the video, I do want to talk about some of the caveats in the data that I have, as always, because this is my own research and analysis. I am not taking somebody else's, so mine may be a little bit different than what you're used to seeing elsewhere on the internet. I am using the results straight from Melee's platform, giving us 1,817 registered players with a full 1,817 deck lists. Sort of. There are 3 decks that were registered for DC that were straight up troll decks, such as the Every Companion Million of Land deck that Frank Karsten pointed out on Twitter. So these do count towards things like metagame share stats, even if they didn't really play around. Additionally, there were a couple of archetypes that were mislabeled, mostly listed as Abzan Aggro, which I'm assuming is just like the first one you can click on when you register a deck list and people were lazy, so those have been corrected. I also went through almost all of the 1,817 decks and either renamed or recategorized them in ways that make the most sense for Pioneer pilots. Now, as an example of what I mean by that, I took lists that were grouped as Rakdos Control and Rakdos Midrange, and then grouped them up with other archetypes that were Boros Tokens into a singleton archetype of Boros Caretaker's Talent. I also weeded out these lists that had Indomitable Creativity or Transmogrify that were in these Boros shells and made them their own archetypes. I also went as far as to weed out the differences between more traditional mono black mid-range lists and decks utilizing the new Unstoppable Slasher Bloodletter of Ecclesot's combo. One of the more notable differences that I am making in my analysis as well is the Gruul decks. There were Prowess and there were Aggro, and those 2 I've grouped together because they follow a similar structure to what the Rakdos Aggro decks are using. Meanwhile, there are the Atarka Red decks, which specifically are using Burning Tree Emissary or the Coyote and doing more of this Reckless Bushwhacker go wide angle of attack, despite both of those decks running Atarka's command across some of the lists. Now, I'm using win rates including ties, which means that ties count in the wins divided by games calculation, which will skew the win rates a little bit lower than you may see elsewhere, where they don't count intentional draws or ties in their overall game record. So in general, the breakdown of my archetypes may be a little bit different than what you see on 17 Lands, from I Love Azorius on Twitter, or from Frank Karsten's article that he's going to report on. Not that one of us is better or worse than the rest, and I love the idea that we have so many data-focused content creators and data-focused content cardboard nerds, really, to just bounce around ideas and try to improve each other's videos and analysis in the formats. So definitely check them out. I've linked some of the things down in the description below. So we all excel in different areas of our analysis, and reading all of our stuff or watching all of our stuff will no doubt help level you up as you watch this content and go through other Pioneer format content. Now that we got some of the nitty-gritty laws of the numbers out of the way, let's take a look at how the metagame shaped up in DC overall this weekend. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there were 1,817 registered players and decks at the RC, which resulted in 119 playable archetypes. Now, as you can see by the graphic, 41 of these archetypes had at least 5 copies at the RC or more, making up just over a third of the RC metagame. That number expands to 55 if you look at all of the archetypes with at least 3 copies in the hall, while 13 additional archetypes had a minimum of 2 copies, and 52 players in the room were one of a kind, with the only copy of their deck being the one that they played. If you want to look at the top 5 archetypes in this breakdown, Azorius Control, Rakdos Aggro, Izzet Phoenix, Enigmatic Incarnation, and Rakdos Transmogrify, these top 5 decks made up 49.6% of the decks in the room, just under half of the RC metagame. So chances were that as you played this enormous 15-round event, you'd run into at least 7 or 8 of these decks, meaning you can probably expect to see them a lot online or at your LGS in the next couple of weeks. Decks that showed up in a surprising amount of numbers include the 5th most played deck, Rakdos Transmogrify, a deck that only popped up online a couple of weeks before the event and had a much smaller metagame share in Brazil just this past weekend. Jun's Sacrifice had a smaller representation than others may have expected, most likely off the back of a poorer showing at the same Brazil RC. If you are interested in learning more about that event in specifics, I have a similar 15-minute version of that breakdown I did last week available on my channel. Gruul Aggro, Mono White Humans, and Selesnya Company were the list that had very little representation leading up to the event for a multitude of different reasons. Gruul took a backseat to big sibling Rakdos in the aggro department, with Claim Fame, Fatal Push, and Thoughtseize being better cards to run over Blossoming Defense and the Hexproof crew. Mono White Humans had been pushed around by Amalia, and then the Sacrifice decks again post-ban, but smelled the rise of Azorius Control in DC. Meanwhile, Selesnya Company, not to be confused with Selesnya Angels, which also runs Collected Company, was a sleeper pick for the event, which relied on the power of 3-drops in general over the Kindred creature type theme. Now, with so many decks at this event, it's really easy to get lost in just how many decks were there when metagame shares are the numbers that you're really looking at. So to make things easier at a glance, I created a popularity tier of decks for the event. Now, the mathy nerdy TLDR is that this is just looking at the standard deviation from the amount of decks played and ranking them based on how far away they are from the average number of a deck played in the room and ranking them from S to D. So, as you can see here, there were a clear top 3 decks played in DC: Azorius Control, Rakdos Aggro, and Izzet Phoenix. That made up 36.9% of the metagame at the RC, well over a third just on their own. Now, just below them in popularity were another powerful trio of archetypes: Enigmatic Incarnation, Rakdos Transmogrify, and Jun's Sacrifice. Now, while not as popular as the previous 3, and in some cases even being half the metagame share of those decks, these A-tier decks made up a decent chunk of the room on their own, with the expectation being you'd see them multiple times during the course of the event. Now, there is an interesting drop-off in popularity after these A-tier decks, and because there's enough distance between the 6th and 7th most popular decks in the room, it's not an error, but the math completely erases the B tier of popularity, which would have been decks represented with between 92 and 54 copies in the room. Instead, we hop right to C tier, where Mono Green Devotion and Abzan Greasefang just barely missed this B tier cutoff at 53 decks apiece. Other popular Pioneer favorites such as Rakdos Midrange, the recent Boros Caretakers list, Lotus Field combo, Azorius Spirits, 5-color Bring to Light, Mono White Humans, Mono Black Waste Knot, and Selesnya Angels all had enough decks in the room to be considered C tier as far as popularity goes. Some interesting C-tier decks include the tournament-winning Rakdos Cauldron deck, the resilient Mono Black Slasher combo / mid-range deck, the 5-color Landfall deck leveraging the new Capenna tricolor fetches, and the aforementioned Selesnya Company deck. Gruul Aggro also popped back up, barely under the cutoff for the non-existent B tier, putting the classic Atarka hexproof spell spin on the aggro shell of the Rakdos deck. Cutting lists down to just the top 10 most popular decks, we can see that although they were popular at the event, it doesn't always mean that they were the most successful. Now, Azorius Control broke dead even with a 50% win rate as the most played deck in the room, although this may look a little bit lower because of all the ties it encountered. Just to note, across 15 rounds of play, the Azorius deck encountered 113 ties, intentional draws or unintentional draws. With those taken out, the deck would have been at a 53% win rate on the weekend. Rakdos Aggro, in the meantime, eked out a 0.1% higher win rate than Azorius Control, so very clearly the deck is just better than the Control deck. That was sarcasm for those that may not have caught on. Izzet Phoenix came back from the ashes this event to just below 50% record at 49.8% win rate, making for a pretty even performance for the Pioneer mainstay. Enigmatic Incarnation was a breakout from Brazil that managed a 50.4% win rate in DC, preying on the popularity of Rakdos decks that couldn't manage to interact as easily with its board state. Rakdos Transmogrify put a copy of the deck in the finals, but had a 48.3% win rate across all 112 decks in the room. Just under average performance for Atraxa and company. Jund's Sacrifice, meanwhile, struggled a bit in a field that knew it was coming, with a better win rate in DC than Brazil, though, at 46.4% overall. Mono Green Devotion had a bit of a bounce back as well from Brazil, settling in at 47.6% win rate on the weekend, which is much better than the 43-ish% it had just a week earlier. Now, Abzan Greasefang, however, was on the other end of the coin here. It took a hit in win rate overall and put up a top 10 low performance at 45.3% for this event. Guess someone revoked their license. Rakdos Midrange, the tried and true mid-range deck of the format, was still played enough to crack the top 10 in popularity, and in true Rakdos/Jund fashion, was pretty close to 50-50 with a 49.6% win rate overall, although this grouping does put the Inti and non-Inti versions together into one archetype. Gruul Aggro, meanwhile, rounds up the top 10 presence decks with a slightly disappointing 45.7% win rate, only 0.4 percentage points above Greasefang. So maybe Rakdos is actually the better option here. Now, while there were way more copies of these decks in the room, that didn't always translate to great results. So let's shift gears just a little bit and highlight 10 decks that put up the highest win rate at the event, regardless of number of decks they had in the room. Two different versions of the 9 lives combo, where you can donate away your enchantment after it's done protecting you to steal games, put up a 66.7% win rate, evoking memories of the demonic pact harmless offering combo we saw in Old Standard and early versions of Pioneer. Now, the rogue factor to these decks may have been a large reason for their success, going 10 and 5 and 0 each in 15 rounds, missing the fight for the Pro Tour invite by just a single match win apiece. Sultai Landfall, a pared down version of the 5-color variation, put up a 64.9% win rate across 3 different decks in the room, including a 70th place finish by Josh Sereno, barely missing a Pro Tour invite. an Azorius spin on the Humans deck, mostly for using Mockingbird as a phantasmal image but Pioneer legal, amassed a 62.2% win rate on the weekend, capping off with a 14th place finish from Michael Greenberg. Congrats on the PT invite! Boros Auras took a aggro list and used some Duskworn upgrades to a 60% win rate. Same for another spin on the Auras deck that decided to use all the colors to do so. 4-color Humans, meanwhile, splashed into more than just Mockingbird and similarly had a 60% win rate, with all 3 of these decks I just mentioned being the lone copies at DC. Enigmatic Fires, which kept the Fires invention in the deck whereas the rest went without it, did better overall than its cousin deck with a 58.9% win rate, but far fewer decks with just 7 in the haul. Selesnya Company, with a surprising 19 total decks, put up incredible results for so many decks in the room, popping off with a 58.6% win rate overall, including putting 3 pilots in the top 64. Rounding out this top 10 win rates is a deck that maintains its loyal fan base across multiple formats no matter how the meta looks. Simic Merfolk had a single deck in DC, and it was good enough for a 58.3% win rate and the 10th highest overall. Before we switch gears to talking about just the top 10 presence decks at the event, I do want to take some extra time to highlight some of the breakout archetypes at DC. These decks weren't top 10 in either win rate or popularity, so to speak, but put up what I would call breakout performances for the event as a whole, and I'd be remiss in my goal to promote Pioneer as a format full of diversity and a lot of fun archetypes if I didn't call them out and talk about them a little bit. These are decks that you'll want to look up if you're a brewer as some inspiration, or decks that you could kind of put together that are a little bit off the meta but still really compete with the top tier decks. All of these will probably wind up being decks that I'm sure to highlight in deck text later on in my channel, so you can probably stay tuned to learn a little bit more details about them than what I'll go into here. First up on the chopping block is tournament-winning Rakdos Cauldron, sometimes known as Rakdos Tree. The deck not only put up the winning list, but across 27 total copies in DC, had a 56.9% win rate, which was good enough for 15th overall for the entire event, and 5th out of decks with more than 1 copy in the room. Overall, this deck looked to leverage Agatha's Soul Cauldron, Voldaren Thrillseeker, and Tree of Perdition inside a semi-normal Rakdos Midrange shell to add back in a combo angle to the deck after Soren's departure from the format. Looks to have worked out pretty nicely. Next, let's take a look at the 2 styles of slasher combo decks, which we've dubbed both Mono Black and Rakdos Slasher. Now, the Mono Black version of the deck put up a staggering 53.3% win rate across 45 total decks. Now, that makes it 26th in overall win rate. It was 10th out of the decks with more than 1 copy in the room. Meanwhile, the Rakdos counterpart had less decks with only 2 overall, but an even higher win rate, barely missing out on that top 10 overall with an 11th place placing at 57.7% for win rate. If you look at decks with more than 1 copy in the room, the deck ranked 5th in that metric. Both of these decks look to utilize the combo of Unstoppable Slasher and Bloodletter of Aclazotz to essentially kill someone in a single turn, with various shells surrounding the 7 to 8 card combo package. The Mono Black list did have green mana for sideboard cards like Back to Nature and other enchantment hate that black alone can't deal with, but were purely black decks in most of the main 60, while Rakdos looked to leverage cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker in the main deck to give extra card selection and then copy effects later on to their deck. Selesnya Company is a deck that I mentioned a few times already because I think it is the overall breakout deck of the tournament, sporting 19 copies and a 9th overall win rate at 58.6% with 3 pilots locking up top 64. The deck itself was ranked 4th when looking at archetypes with more than 1 copy in the room, and overall outperformed the Selesnya Angels version that a lot of people, myself included, thought would be the go-to Selesnya shell. Instead, this deck utilized the power of 3 or less mana cost to make both Collected Company and Enduring Innocence powerhouse cards alongside just enough interactive hate bear style creatures to win a bunch of games. Azorius Lotus Field is a rampy twist on the most popular Azorius Control archetype that was the more popular variant of the deck about a year ago, but it has fallen to the wayside as the normal control variety, as noted by this tournament, and the Lotus Field combo deck have taken 2 parts and split them into better constructed or more popular constructed decks. However, the deck popped back up in DC with 11 copies and put up a 57.4% win rate overall, making it the 12th best deck in the entire field. If you narrow that down to decks with more than 1 copy, it's 6th place, so even better. Pilots such as Patrick Wu, who took the deck all the way to the top 8, took out the discontinuity side of the deck and relied on strict Proctor to stifle their Lotus Field triggers, while they added in Horned Lockwhale to complement their pair of powerful Planeswalkers to win games. Lastly, I do want to call out Dimir Rogues as a deck that has hung on in the lower tiers of popularity for so long, I think it rivals the mainstay of Izzet Phoenix on its longevity factor. Now, with 7 decks and a 53.1% win rate, the deck didn't put up a top 8 performance like it did in Brazil, but it did manage the 25th highest win rate at the event. If you take out all those singleton decks in the room, that number jumps up to 11th in win rate overall. Although not every Rogues list is choosing to run Mockingbird, the Bird Bard no doubt has played part in why the deck has come back into the picture, as consistency in copies of its key creatures bumps up the success rate of the deck quite a bit, in addition to playing a more tempo style of game that some of the slower and control-y decks have a hard time dealing with. Now that we had our fill of things from a go-wide perspective, let's focus a little bit more and tackle the top 10 presence decks and highlight how they performed against one another. This way, you'll get a deeper perspective on how they interact with one another, and it'll paint a better picture as how you want to approach your local game events or Magic the Gathering online leagues and challenges in the next couple of weeks. Starting from the top, let's see how the 50-50 across the event Azorius Control fared against just the top decks. Control did the thing it wanted to against the aggro lists, as well as being able to shut down the Sacrifice and Boros lists from getting their engines going thanks to plenty of permission and exile effects. The deck also sported great win rates against the Enigmatic deck, as they lack the same sort of interaction other decks are able to run to protect their spells, and Get Lost is a pretty good card. Somewhat unexpectedly, Control had a positive win rate against the Rakdos Midrange decks, although this could be due to the number of Inti low curve Rakdos decks that were included in this grouping. Control was on the slight losing end of the Phoenix matchup at this RC, while it also fared a little below average against the newer Rakdos Transmogrify lists. Fast combos like Greasefang and Green Devotion were able to get under the 2 and 3 mana interaction that most control lists are running, and had the ability to close out games before the deck could really clean up the board. Overall, the deck had positive win rates against half of the top decks in the field, which is pretty much where you want to be if you're building a control deck for a specific event and a specific targeted type of metagame. The Rakdos Aggro list continued to really punish a lot of the decks that were going for combo type things, having very high win rates against the Green Devotion and Abzan Greasefang decks, just being able to sneak under what the big things were doing there. Meanwhile, it put up a very good win rate against the Jund Sacrifice list, which meant that it was also fast enough to race the cat combo. Now, a little surprisingly, it did very well into the Izzet Phoenix matchup with a 53.1% win rate there, being just slightly above average compared to the pilots in Brazil that were slightly below average just a weekend ago. Now, the deck did struggle against some of the more controlling and dedicated mid-range style of decks, where Rakdos Midrange, Boros Caretakers, Enigmatic Incarnation, and Azorius Control were all below 50% matchups. But the worst deck in the room from these top 10 decks for the Rakdos Aggro list was the Rakdos Transmogrify list. So it was a bit of a family-on-family affair, as a very fast Atraxa was super difficult for the deck based around killing your opponent as quick as possible to combat a 7/7 Vigilance lifelinker. Izzet Phoenix had a pretty solid weekend, especially if it decided to face up against the Abzan Greasefang and Rakdos Transmogrify decks in the room, as both of those were very favorable matchups for Phoenix. It also did well against the Mono Green Devotion list, showing that they were packing just enough interaction against these decks to slow them down and let the Phoenixes take over the skies. It did kind of flip-flop the narrative against the Azorius Control decks from what we saw in Brazil, winning slightly more than half of the matchups against the most popular deck in the room, which is a good place to be when you're going to be playing against that deck like 200 times in the tournament. Now, the other matchups that are a little bit more mid-rangey were kind of coin flippy, as there wasn't really a below 45% win rate deck for Izzet Phoenix in the top 10, besides the traditional Rakdos Midrange decks, which is kind of to be expected. So Phoenix overall against these top decks, not the worst spot in the metagame for the deck to be. Now, the non-Fires version of Enigmatic Incarnation was a deck that was looking to prey upon a lot of the Black X mid-range decks, and we knew coming into this event also had a very solid Izzet Phoenix matchup. Now, what we didn't anticipate was that there would be so many of these Rakdos-colored decks that the Enigmatic deck feasted upon them. Rakdos Midrange, Rakdos Transmogrify, even Rakdos Aggro, and heck, throw Jund Sacrifice in there. Huge win rates for the Enigmatic Incarnation deck to prey upon. This also meant that the Boros Caretakers deck, going a very similar route but then subbing in white instead of black and playing to the board, was ripe for this Enigmatic Incarnation deck to just kind of feast upon. The one matchup that it did not want to see in the room, however, was Azorius Control, as a 38.3% win rate was the worst matchup for Incarnation by far. Rakdos Transmogrify did want to see some of its family affair style decks having positive win rates against the Rakdos Aggro list and the Jund Sacrifice deck, but definitely did not want to see some of the other versions of the deck, such as Rakdos Midrange. Now, some of the more fair style decks, like Boros Caretakers, is going to be some place where Rakdos Transmogrify will excel, and the fact that it has a combo finishy package means that it can do a little bit better against the control decks when you draw that hand disruption and then flip over a giant Atraxa. Now, the downside is with this kind of combo we finish, the Transmogrified deck doesn't have the same number of threats and removal to really go up against the Izzet Phoenix and Enigmatic Incarnation decks that are really there to hinder it. We did also see them having a good win rate against the Abzan Greasefang deck, because it turns out putting a 7/7 lifelinker in front of a bunch of 4/4 angels or 5/5 flying vehicles is very favorable for the Rakdos player. Now, Jund Sacrifice had a bit of a rough go at this event, but it did still have some matchups where it was on the favorable side of things. It did its due diligence in taking on the Phoenix deck head-to-head and coming out with a 54.9% win rate in that matchup, while also being fairly well positioned against the Abzan Greasefang deck and the Boros Caretakers decks. Turns out when you have a bunch of small tokens, if you don't have one of those Anthem effects down early, the Sacrifice deck can pick you apart, or just wait until it cat combos you out. Now, some of these more mid-range oriented lists were a bit harder for the Jund Sacrifice deck to deal with, and then there are also going to be decks like the Mono Green Devotion deck, which can just kind of kill you too quickly to let you get that combo online. Now, some of the worst matchups in the room for this deck are the Enigmatic Incarnation deck, which has way too many enchantments and temporary lockdown type effects for the Jund Sacrifice list to contend with, as well as the Azorius Control deck with board wipes that exile and the ability to run Rest in Peace to completely shut off the cat combo. Abzan Greasefang kind of went back to being high highs and low lows at DC, as we can see that there were some very favorable matchups, but also some very unfavorable ones for the deck. Now looking at big number do good, Rakdos Midrange was surprisingly an 85.7% win rate for the Greasefang combo deck, which again may go to show that the Inti style versions of this deck are not as good against some of these faster combo centric or big creature style decks. We can also see that the Greasefang deck did attack the top end of the metagame in Azorius Control with a 60.4% win rate against the control matchup, but then on the flip side also attacked the 10th most popular deck, Boros Caretaker's Talent, but just kind of flying over everything they wanted to do. It was fast enough to take down the mono green devotion deck on a somewhat consistent basis, but when you get towards the middle of the pack where a majority of these matches were played, you can see where the struggles kind of come into fruition. Izzet Phoenix was a very difficult matchup as there's just way too many recursive blockers for the Greasefang deck to ever push through lethal damage, and then when you start putting in things like Ashiok or ways to just kill Greasefang, the Phoenix deck is very powerful in that head-to-head matchup. We also see it struggle against the Enigmatic Incarnation deck, which is able to run Temporary Lockdown and Rest in Peace, and then also the Rakdos Transmogrify list, where putting an Atroxa into play, as we said before, very strong thing to do against 4/4 flyers. The Green Devotion list had some pretty decent matchups, including a surprisingly high win rate against the Azorius Control decks. So this time around, the Devotion side was a little bit too fast for some of the board wipes and the control package that Azorius was bringing to the table here. It also wound up doing decently into the Jund Sacrifice deck, being able to kill that deck before the combo was online, and then just the normal Sacrifice style is not going to be fast enough to kill the Devotion deck if they get a grid star or they don't need elves to start ramping up their mana base. It also had a good win rate into the Rakdos Midrange list, which again could be because the Rakdos Midrange lists are still trying to find the correct configuration of creatures and interaction spells to try to combat the metagame. Now, where the Devotion deck struggled was against the aggro list specifically, as Rakdos Aggro was its worst matchup of these top 10 presence decks, as well as the Izzet Phoenix deck and the Rakdos Transmogrify decks, and then again a little bit slower against the Abzan Greasefang deck. Rakdos Midrange, when all of these other varieties of Black X midrange decks are floating around, was still popular enough to be 9th place overall in the metagame share, but didn't necessarily have the best matchups against the top decks in the room. It proved its mid-range superiority against the Boros Caretaker's Talent deck, as well as being able to edge out games against the more combo-centric mid-range decks like Rakdos Transmogrify and Jund Sacrifice, as well as Izzet Phoenix. Packing just enough removal this time around to beat out the Rakdos Aggro list, it looks like as long as you are putting creatures on the board that could be dealt with or blocked, Rakdos Midrange was a great choice. But when you wind up getting into spells that are on the stack, board wipes, and enchantments, that's where this deck has yet to find its footing, with an abysmal win rate against the Enigmatic Incarnation deck, a very bad win rate against the Abzan Greasefang deck, although a smaller sample size, and a less than 50% win rate against the Azorius Control decks. If you expect to see things shift towards the multicolor and control-y style decks, your mid-range package is going to have to adapt to combat them over these creature decks it was teched for this tournament. Now, the Gruul version of the aggro list had a bit of a rougher time than its Rakdos counterpart, only really coming out on top against the Enigmatic Incarnation deck thanks to some green splashes for enchantment hate, and the Jund Sacrifice deck where the speed of it and the Rakdos Aggro deck was usually enough to beat out the combo-centric deck before it could start gaining life off of Cat Oven shenanigans. The Gruul deck, however, was extremely unfavored in some of the worst matchups that were also the ones for the Rakdos Aggro deck, including the Azorius Control and Abzan Greasefang matchups. So when it comes to deciding which flavor of aggro is best for the current metagame, although Gruul has some protection spells you would think make it better against some of those mid-range decks, the recursion from Claim Fame and other spells in the Rakdos Aggro deck that can take threats away from the opponent's hands are sometimes better than needing to hold open mana to protect your things. The regional championship in Washington, D.C. was as exciting as the new background that my wife put together for our videos, but there's still a lot about the Pioneer format that has yet to unfold. There is an additional regional championship that is going to be hosted in the European region in just a couple of weeks, so we'll probably have an even better picture of what is powerful in Pioneer and what will rise to the top of the metagame, even though we have all this data coming out of DC. But for the time being, let me know in the comments below what your favorite decks were at the RC, or what you're looking forward to most about Pioneer, or even just the fact that Star City Games is back in charge of competitive Magic coverage. While you're down there, you can of course press that thumbs up button to let us know how much you love competitive Magic the Gathering. And of course, as always, you can tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general Magic content from me. Thanks to all my members, and we'll see you at the next RC.